general fund, and in part from transfers from the trust fund. And the trust fund is out there basically to handle the cash flow problem that revenues come in and go out on different schedules. But it's pretty clear that we haven't been fully funding the actual outlays of our federal highway expenditures there, and that the trust fund is scheduled to disappear, or is likely to disappear in the near future unless something is done. So this is a very difficult issue here, and we'll see that it is also an issue for the state and is also an issue for local government. So what we've got here, just by way of introduction, is we've got a national, a state, and a local problem all across the country of shortfalls in road funding. And the traditional sources of road funding, of course, are motor fuel taxes. And we like motor fuel taxes as a way to fund roads because it turns those taxes into a kind of user fee. If you have to fill up the tank in order to drive on the roads, the taxes you pay while you're filling up the tank pay for maintenance of the roads. And so as people drive, they end up paying for the road maintenance and road construction on the roads in which they're driving, and so that's been our tradition for a long time. But as you see, that has been falling short in recent years, and that's been true for the federal government, and that's true for state and local governments as well. Let me the next slide here. Well, here are the Indiana motor fuel taxes, and these are the statewide taxes that generate the revenue for both the state and the local governments. We've got an 18-cent per gallon gasoline tax here in Indiana. So it's an excise tax. An excise tax is a tax that is on a specific product, usually done on a per unit rather than a percentage of price basis. So it's 18 cents per gallon sold. And then for diesel fuel, or it's called the special fuels tax, we've got 16 cents per gallon. But we've also got a motor carrier surcharge tax, which is on the trucks. And that is self-reported for mileage, but that's also 11 cents per gallon. And then we apply the sales tax to the full price of fuel, including the taxes. So we actually tax the taxes with our sales tax as well as the underlying price of motor fuel, and so we've got our 7% sales tax applied to motor fuel taxes as well. Now the gasoline tax, special fuels tax, and motor carrier surcharge tax, that revenue is for the most part earmarked for road maintenance. The sales tax, of course, is a general revenue source that funds all of state government. Here's a map of the state gasoline excise tax rates, and you see the lightest blue color there is 0 to 20, and Indiana is in that category of among the low cents per gallon excise tax rates. And then the darker blue moves up all the way to more than 30 there, which you see in Maine and Vermont and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and the whole West Coast, North Carolina, and then the whole West Coast as well, for more than 30 cents per gallon. I looked to see if I could do a map like this for the special fuel taxes and the diesel fuel taxes, but, well, frankly, those taxes are, what you might say, all over the map. There are so many different sorts of taxes that the various states use that I wasn't quite confident enough to add those up and make a map of the thing. For example, on some of the lists that you see of special fuel taxes for the states, diesel fuel taxes, our 11-cent motor carrier tax is not included. And so I wonder what else isn't included for the other states. So we'll do most of this analysis based on the gasoline tax simply because it's more straightforward and easier to understand. But you got to remember that diesel fuel is taxed as well and taxed at different, usually higher rates than the gasoline tax. Well, Indiana has, as you can see, a relatively low excise tax rate at 18 cents. 18 cents ranks us 42nd among all the states, tied with Alabama, as a matter of fact. And you can see that Michigan is also low, but most of the other states that are low tend to be in the southern part of the United States. The median excise tax rate is 24 cents per gallon. And let me point out as well that 8 states have local excise taxes. And this is an idea that is considered in Indiana once in a while. I know there have been bills. I know that because when I worked at the Legislative Services Agency as a sometime consultant, sometimes one of the things that we had to try to figure out was how much could each county raise from a penny local option excise tax. But of course, nothing like that has ever passed in Indiana. But 8 states do have local excise taxes, and among our neighbors, Illinois, and in the Chicago and Cook County area, they have excise tax rates that are added on to the state rate. But with only 8 states doing that, that turns out to be pretty rare. So Indiana, I think we can say, has a low state gasoline excise tax rate. However, if you look at it from the point of view of the taxpayers, and what I've got here is the top half of a chart straight off of the American Petroleum Institute's website, and this is their tabulation of gasoline motor fuel taxes as of the middle of 2015, and you will note that Indiana ranks 11th among all of the states. The American Petroleum Institute, the drivers, who at least a lobbyist organization that thinks about tax payments from the point of view of drivers, thinks that Indiana has a high tax rate. And the reason they think that is because we've got that 7% sales tax tacked on to the other excise tax rates. Now, most states don't do that. 10 states, by my count, apply the sales tax to motor fuel. And the other states, the other 40 states, simply say, well, because we've got an excise tax on the motor fuel, we won't also apply the sales tax. So Indiana does that, and of the, Indiana ranks 11th, so of the 10 states above us and Indiana, of those 11 states, 8 of those states are among those that use the sales tax and apply the sales tax to motor fuel. So that really does increase the perceived tax, or the actual tax paid on motor fuel by the drivers. Now, Pennsylvania, at number 1 there, turns out not to be one of those states that has a sales tax on motor fuel. They simply have an excise tax that's 50 cents per gallon, and that puts them way up. That last bar that you see right there on the far right, that is the same size for everybody, that's the federal tax. So that's the 18.4 cent federal per gallon tax that helps fund the Highway Trust Fund. So as you see, from the point of view of drivers anyway, from the point of view of taxpayers, Indiana's tax is high, and that's entirely because of the additional 7% sales tax that we add on. Of course, as I said, the reason that we don't think about that sales tax very often when we talk about road funding is because that sales tax is a general source of revenue. The sales tax on gasoline does fund roads to some degree, and we'll talk about that, but it also funds schools and state parks and Medicaid and everything else that the state does. So it's not a dedicated tax source to road construction or for road funding. Well, here's gasoline tax revenue in Indiana from 1973 to 2013, and so the blue line there shows in millions of dollars how much gasoline tax revenue we've actually collected. And then the red lines there show the years in which we had different tax rates. So back in the 70s, we were taxing at 8 cents per gallon, and then for a little while, we went to a percentage of price. We then went up to 14 cents a gallon, and then 15 cents a gallon, and then most recently, along about 2004, we increased the excise tax to 18 cents a gallon. So we've had this 18 cents a gallon tax rate for a little more than a decade right now. You'll notice when we do raise the tax rate, you see revenue pop up, as you would expect. You also will see there the blue stripes on the chart, and those mark off the recessions, and you usually see revenue decline during recessions, and generally you see revenue rising during expansions, or at least you did during the 1980s and the 1990s. However, after the most recent increase in the excise tax in 2004, revenue has begun to decline. Right? We were at about $580 million from the gasoline tax in 2004, and now we're down to about $520. So gasoline tax revenue has been declining, and that's the source of the road funding problem that we've been seeing on our state and local level. How do we pay for road maintenance? And it's similarly the source of the federal problem, because if our per gallon tax is declining in revenue raised, then the federal per gallon tax, which is 18.4 cents, must be showing the same thing. And we know that, in fact, it's not just an Indiana problem. It is a nationwide problem. So the question is, why? Why is this happening? Why is gasoline tax revenue falling? Why is this nice user fee sort of tax, this per gallon excise tax, generating less and less revenue year after year for the last 10 years? And the answer, of course, is that the number of gallons purchased has been falling. And I say estimated gallons of gasoline sold in Indiana from 1973 to 2014. It's estimated because all I did was take the revenue raised from the gasoline tax and divided it by the per gallon rate. And one would guess that that'd be a pretty good estimate of how many gasolines were sold, or at least how many gasolines that were sold were actually taxed. So I suppose this should say estimated taxed gallons of gasoline sold in Indiana. But what you see is a peak in 2001, and in most years a decline since then. And you will notice that the scale on this thing starts at 2,000 million or 2 billion gallons and goes up to 3.4 billion. So it's a little distorted in that way. But we do that just so you can see the ups and downs. One thing that you can see is that recessions really matter. In every recession that we've marked off there, you see that the number of gallons sold actually goes down. So when people have less income, when there's more unemployment, they buy less gasoline. And it's also the case that if they're unemployed, well, they don't have to drive to work. And if business is down, all those gasoline-powered vehicles don't have to do as much driving. So recessions really do have an impact on the gallons of gasoline sold. But you'll notice that in the 1980s, after what we used to call the Great Recession of 1979-81, the double dip there, after that, the decline from that recession, gallons rose. And then there was a recession in 1990-91, and after that, gallons rose rather rapidly, from 2.6 billion to 3.3 billion from about 1991 to 2001. So over that decade, a very rapid increase in the number of gallons sold. And then another recession drove down gasoline sold, but then in the recovery of 2001 to 2007, gasoline gallons sold declined. And in the recovery now, since our most recent Great Recession, gasoline gallons sold have declined. And so something has changed since about 2001, and whatever it is, and I'll show you what I think it is, but something has changed so that now when the economy expands, it doesn't take gallons of gasoline along with it. Gallons of gasoline have been falling even as the economy has been expanding. Why is that? Well, I think there are three reasons. One of the reasons is increased fuel efficiency. One of the reasons is price of gasoline. And one of the reasons is income growth. So we're kind of looking at demand here. If you remember your Economics 101, price and income are things that determine demand. Excuse me. Well, here's the average miles per gallon for automobiles in the United States from 1973 to 2013. And again, you can get this from the Federal Highway Administration data source. And we see back in 1973, the average automobile was getting a little bit more than 13 miles per gallon, which we would these days think was totally unacceptable. But that was the average back then, and that probably means there were a whole lot of cars getting less than 10. But as the price of gasoline went up, and as we began to pay more attention to this issue of fuel efficiency, we saw a rather rapid increase from about 1973 through about 1991. Average miles per gallon go up from about 13 to about 21. So rapid rise then, and then a rise, but a little bit more slow from 1991 through the present. And so we've gone up from about 21 to about 23 over the course of the last couple of decades. So average miles per gallon have been increasing. And so fuel efficiency, one would expect that increased fuel efficiency would reduce the number of gallons purchased. And this is I think the problem that is cited most frequently as the reason why gallons of gasoline are declining, and why the gasoline and diesel fuel excise taxes are in trouble as a way of funding road construction. If the cars that are driving on the roads simply don't need as much gasoline as they used to, and yet they still put the same wear on the roads that they used to, well, we've got a problem in terms of maintaining those roads. I would point out, though, that this can't be the only answer because, number one, here in the decade of the 2000s and the decade of the 2010s, we've seen declines in average miles per gallon, but we have not seen an acceleration of fuel efficiency. If anything, since 2008 or so, fuel efficiency has been rather stable. And so if we were going to explain the sudden decline in gallons sold, we would have expected, if average miles per gallon was the reason, we would have expected an acceleration of fuel efficiency, but that hasn't happened. Let me point out as well that during the 80s and during the 90s, the amount of gasoline sold increased at a time when miles per gallon was increasing. And so despite the increase of fuel efficiency in the 80s and 90s, gallons sold still increased. So while we know that in the long run, this is the thing that will create the problem, it can't be the full explanation for why gallons sold peaked in 2001 and have begun to decline since then. For the rest of the explanation, you have to look at income and price. And here's price. Now, here's the price of gasoline. Average price of gasoline, 1973 to 2015. The blue line is the current price, the actual price that you pay on average each year. And the red line is probably the one that really matters for us. That's the inflation-adjusted price, or that's the price of gasoline relative to the prices of everything else. So is gasoline rising in price relative to the price of pizza and shoes and everything else that you might buy, or is it falling relative to the price of everything else? Now, from 1981 through about 2001, we generally had a decline in the inflation-adjusted price. That is, gasoline was becoming cheaper relative to everything else. That was especially true in the 1980s, but generally true in the 1990s as well, except for a few years at the end of that decade. The relative price, the inflation-adjusted price of gasoline was going down. And we know from, again, Econ 101, when something becomes cheaper, people tend to buy more of it. So a decline in price should have encouraged people to buy more gasoline, and perhaps it did. However, starting in about 2002, and except for 1 year in 2009, continuing through about 2013-14, the price of gasoline relative to the price of everything else went up, and in the early part of our recovery since the Great Recession, remained high. Gasoline became more expensive, and so people bought less of it. Well, we see here in, as we know, in 2014 here and now in 2015, the price of gasoline has come down. You know, it's bouncing up and down around $3.50, and now it's around $2.50. So we've seen a drop of $1. And perhaps that means that people will be buying more gasoline, and I'll have some projections on that here, or at least some speculation about that in just a minute. So I think price must have mattered. When gasoline sales were rising, it was because price was falling. When gasoline sales were falling, price was rising. I think income has something to do with it as well. Why would income have anything to do with it? Well, partly because when the economy is expanding, more businesses use more gasoline, but also in terms of people being able to afford gasoline. If incomes are growing more rapidly, you can increase your gasoline purchases. If income is growing slowly or if it's falling, we know that they decrease their gasoline purchases, or if it's growing slowly, they increase their purchases more slowly. Well, if you take a look at Indiana real personal income growth, and again, this is inflation adjusted, and these are the average growth rates each year for Indiana personal income, and personal income is wages, interest, rent, and profits earned in Indiana, as well as government transfer payments. And what you see is during the 80s and during the 90s, the growth rates bounced up and down between 2% and 4%, and occasionally even exceeded 4%. And this is above inflation. So this is what we would now consider pretty rapid growth, because if you look at what's happened since 2001, you see that in the recovery for an expansion from 2001 to 2007, we topped 2% in just 1 year, and only just in 2006. And so our growth here in Indiana was very slow during the 2000s, and this was true for the entire Great Lakes region. It wasn't something particularly special for Indiana, but the entire Great Lakes region saw slow personal income growth during the expansion of the 2000s. And since that's where an awful lot of manufacturing gets done, I think it had to do with the decline of manufacturing employment that occurred during that decade. It declined during the 2001 recession and then never really recovered. And this has to do with advances in technology, meaning we can produce the same manufactured goods with fewer people, but also had to do with the shift, the global shifts in where manufacturing is done. And yes, I'm talking to you, China. So we see slower growth in Indiana in the 2000s. And this recovery that we've had has looked a little bit better in Indiana than in what we experienced in the 2000s, except for the dip that we saw in 2014. But nonetheless, it still is not what we saw in the 80s and the 90s. So for the last 15 years or so, our income has been growing more slowly. And sure enough, that's just when gasoline gallon purchases have begun to decline. So I think we've got three things that are causing this change. Miles per gallon has been increasing. Price was high for about 15 years after the year 2000, and income growth has been slow since about 2001. Well, I couldn't resist. I did some statistical work just to see if I couldn't put some numbers on this, and I did. It worked out pretty well. And so what you see in the left-hand column here is those three determinants of gasoline sales. And we've got real income, gas price, and miles per gallon for automobiles. And the next column are what we call in the economics biz elasticities. And elasticities measure the percentage change in one thing relative to the percentage change in another. So this is the elasticity of gasoline sales relative to real income, to the gas price, and to miles per gallon. And the way you use these things is you get a percentage change like 2.6%, you see in the second column of numbers there. 2.6% is the average change in real income from 1982 to 2001, 2.6% per year above inflation. And the elasticity is 0.8, which says that for every 1% increase in real income, gasoline sales increase by 0.8%, and every 10% increase creates an 8% increase in gasoline sales. So if you multiply the 0.8 times the 2.6, you can say if the only thing that happened during this period was real income increasing by 2.6% per year, then gallons sold would have increased by 2.1% per year. The elasticity on gas price is very small. It's minus 0.1, and that's what we call inelastic, very inelastic, again, in the economics business. And we think that that's true because, at least in the short run, it's very hard to adjust your gas purchases when price rises or price falls. If price goes up, you'd say, well, maybe I'll get myself a new, more fuel-efficient car. Maybe I'll move closer to work so I don't have to drive as much. But those kinds of decisions are hard to make, not the kind of decisions you can make day to day. So as far as day to day and week to week and month to month sales, when gas price goes up, maybe we combine trips to school and to the grocery store, but and cancel a vacation or two, but it's very hard. And that is reflected by the very small elasticity, the very small response of gasoline sales to gasoline price. However, when we had the average change in gasoline prices from 1982 to 2001 declining by 2.4% per year, that meant each year we got an extra 0.2% growth in gasoline sales as a result of that price change. What about miles per gallon? Well, the elasticity minus, of course, 0.6. So as fuel efficiency improves, gasoline sales decline. You multiply that minus 0.6 times the 1.4% average increase in miles per gallon over the 20 years in the 80s and 90s, and you get minus 0.8. So minus 0.8% per year decline in gallons sold because of fuel efficiency improvements. You can add up those three and you get a predicted change of 1.5% growth over that period every year. The actual change was 1.8, so there's some other stuff going on that is apart from these three factors, but I'd say these three factors explain pretty well what must have been happening over that 20-year period. So how did things change from 2001 to 2011? Well, real income grew much more slowly, 0.5%. And so that added only a 0.4%, 0.5 times 0.8, only 0.4% to gallon growth. Gas prices went up on average 6.4% per year, and even though the elasticity is really small, an increase of that much means a contribution of minus 0.6%. And then miles per gallon in automobiles actually grew more slowly in this decade than it had in the previous 20 years, but was still growing, and so that contributed to more reductions in gasoline sales. If you add those up, you get minus 0.5, or a predicted decline every year in gasoline sales. The actual decline was 0.9%. So again, there are other things going on as well, but these three factors really help, I think, explain why the change after 2001. Why the change? The main reasons are slower income growth and higher gasoline prices. Well, looking forward then, what's likely to happen in the future? Well, next 5 years. Take these elasticities and say, well, what's going to happen to income and gas prices and fuel efficiency over the next 5 years? Let's suppose that miles per gallon continue to rise as they have been over the last 10 years, so 0.5 percentage point per year. So we'll be rising essentially by a tenth, because the miles per gallon are in the low 20s, and so 0.5% a year will be an extra tenth, and so we'll be pushing an extra half point by 2020 if this happens. And so we should expect a continued downward pressure from increasing fuel efficiency in the contribution to gallons, but of only 0.3% per year. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen to income? What's going to happen to the gas price? Well, we don't know, but let's take a couple of guesses. Let's take a guess that says, hey, maybe income will grow 2% per year. That's what the revenue forecasters for the state of Indiana think that's going to happen. That's what the utility forecasters think is going to happen. So the betting is, I guess you'd say, that Indiana real income will grow about 2% per year. And then you add inflation to that of 1.5 or 2%, and overall growth will be 3.5 or 4. So 2% times the 0.8 elasticity means 1.6% growth. Let's suppose that the gasoline price stays down at $2.50. It doesn't grow, and so there would be no impact from the gas price. And so what do we get? We add those up, we get a predicted increase of 1.3%. That is, if gasoline prices stay low and if income grows at 2%, we should see a turnaround in gasoline sales over the next 5 years. Do I think that's going to happen? I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because it just isn't appropriate for economists to be optimistic. That's why. And this says, hey, part of our funding problem is going to be solved by a turnaround in gasoline sales. Now, we haven't seen a turnaround yet, not through 2014 at any rate. Fiscal year 2015 data, I'll be able to get a hold of that by December, probably, and so we'll be able to take a look and see what has happened. We would expect something of a turnaround. If there's going to be a turnaround, really ought to show up in the fiscal 2015 data, because at least half of that year saw lower gas prices. We'll see. On the other hand, and I'm an economist, so I always get another hand, what if real income only grows 1% a year? What if gasoline prices edge back up to $3.50 by 2020? If that happens, well, we should see a continued slow but continued decline in gallon sales, but a slowdown in gallon sales. So I guess if you think that nothing has changed, or if you think that the behavior of people and the economy relative to income and prices and fuel efficiency will continue to be the same as it's been over the last 30 years, you would have to predict that gallon sales are going to recover over the next 5 years. If they don't, well, then maybe something has changed. And of course, we've had some evidence that something has changed. We think consumers were really affected. Consumer behavior was really affected by the trauma of the Great Recession. Savings rates are up, and consumer spending is only now beginning to recover. So it's possible that something fundamental has changed about how consumers behave and how drivers behave. And if that's true, maybe we won't see a recovery. But lower prices and more rapid income growth really ought to increase gasoline sales. All right, the low elasticity, I wanted to do this because this is a nice rule of thumb to have in your head. What is 1 penny on the gasoline tax raise? Right, we've got 18 cents. What would happen if we put it up to 19 cents? How much extra revenue would we likely receive? And of course, if you do that, if you really want to do it right, you got to realize that when you change the price of something, you affect the quantity sold. But because that elasticity, because that response of gasoline sales to price is so small, you can almost ignore that factor, at least for very small changes in gasoline tax rates. Now let me demonstrate why I think that's true. Let's start with the gasoline price at $2.50, and let's add a penny on the gasoline tax, which would presumably increase the price to $2.51. That's a percentage increase in price of 0.4%, a penny on $2.50. And with the gas price elasticity of minus 0.1, the change in gasoline gallons sold would be minus 0.04%. In other words, a very, very small number. The sales of gasoline in 2014, just short of 3 billion gallons, so 2.9 billion. So 0.04% of 2.9 billion gallons is 1.2 million gallons. In other words, a very small amount. And so you can pretty much say that a penny on 2.9 billion gallons raises about $29 million. So each extra penny gives you $29 million. Now, you know, if you doubled the thing and added 18 cents, you wouldn't want to say 18 times 29 million, because then the reduction in gasoline sales begins to become measurable. But for a penny, about 29 million, nice rule of thumb right there. Well, how much do we spend in Indiana on state and local highways, roads and streets? And here it is per person from 2013. This again comes from the Census Governmental Finances data, which adds it up nationwide and gives state totals. And as always, the census numbers, you can never make them match exactly with what comes out of the Indiana budgets and local government budgets, but it's the only shot we've got at making comparisons across the different states. And so I went to that, and again, the reference is at the end. You look at this, highway expenditures per person, and Indiana is among these lower states in expenditures at less than 400. We do have to be careful with these numbers, though, because when you look at which states spend the most per person, you mostly get the great big states in the Great Plains and the mountain areas, all the way from Wisconsin to Montana. And this is not exactly true of Wisconsin and Minnesota, but certainly true for the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Montana, and Wyoming. What you got is a whole lot of land area where you got to run roads for very long distances, but not a whole lot of people. And so you take all of a lot of people to pay for it. So you take that few expenditures from those from the taxes from those people and spread it over those folks. You get a lot of expenditures. You get more than $600 per person. And so land area matters pretty clearly, although you've got Maine and Vermont, as you can see, also spending quite a bit per person. To try to control for that, what I did was, hey, let's take states with similar populations. Let's not count the Dakotas and Montana and Wyoming and those places with very, very small population densities. Let's take all of the states with populations between 5 and 8 million. So that's Indiana's at about 6.5 million. So that's 1.5 million above, 1.5 million below. And there are 12 states with populations between 5 and 8 million. And let's take a look at the average per person expenditures on highways for those 12 states. And the average turns out to be $489 per person. Indiana's number is 388, which ranks us 10th among the 12 states with populations similar to ours. Minnesota is highest at $694 per person. So I think on this map that you see, we're low. When you compare us to states that are similar in population size to Indiana, we are low. I think we can probably conclude that we are a relatively low spender on state and local highways. And given that our excise taxes are low, certainly both sides of the budget then match up. We're not raising that much revenue relative to the rest of the states from our gasoline and motor fuel taxes, and therefore we're not spending much per person either. So Indiana, a relatively low spender on state and local highways. I had to put this in here somewhere, but and I'm sticking it right in here, and you'll see why. But this is the National Highway Construction Cost Index, and again, the Federal Highway Administration does this, and so what they do is it's like the Consumer Price Index, or only instead of taking the prices of consumer goods and averaging them out, they take the prices of things that are needed when you build a highway. So you've got concrete and asphalt and equipment, and highway construction wages would be included in the Highway Construction Cost Index. What you see is that from 2000 to about 2006, the costs increased quite a bit, quite rapidly. In fact, it was rising by 6.3% per year over that period. But since then, not so much. We had a period when it actually declined from 2006 to 2009, probably related to the recession and the lack of demand for these resources that go into road construction. And since then, since about 2010, we have seen increases, but it's been just 1.2% per year. So road construction costs have been rising, not that rapidly, and yet one gets the impression from the road folks and the street folks and the highway construction folks and the local agencies and state agencies, departments of transportation and so forth, that costs have been rising. So maybe they're facing costs that are not captured by the National Highway Construction Cost Index, or maybe they are comparing what's going on with their costs to what's going on with their revenues. Costs may not be rising very rapidly, but revenues have been falling. And so what we get then is this chart right here, which is Indiana local road funding, actual, the black line, and then cost adjusted, that is divided by that Highway Construction Cost Index that we've just looked at. And what you see, especially from about 2003 to about 2013, that 10-year period, a decline in both the actual and the real cost-adjusted highway construction costs. It's down 18%, 18.5% in real terms between 2003 and 2013. Now, what real terms here means, we're comparing the revenue that's collected to the costs of actually doing the work. And so you might call it the purchasing power of your highway construction revenue dollar, and the purchasing power is down. And that especially took place from 2003 to 2006, slight recovery since then, but nonetheless lower now than it was, or lower in 2013 than it was 10 years before. You'll notice a rather big jump in 2014. This has been an issue. And certainly the city and town and county highway and road and street departments and the Indiana Department of Transportation has been letting the legislature know that revenues are falling short and road maintenance has been stressed by the lack of revenue. And in 2014, the state did something about that. And so now I want to turn to Indiana transportation funding and get down to some nitty-gritty specifics about how we actually do it. And for that, I need to show you the famous flow chart of Indiana transportation funding, and here it is. And what I hope is happening out there is either nods because you've seen this before, or gasps because you think I'm going to try to explain this, or laughter because it is so ridiculously complicated. But there it is. You can get this out of the, sorry. Tamara is reminding me here that I should ask a question. And I forget what the question is, Tamara. What question were we going to ask?
Do you understand the question?
Okay, we'll ask the question here. So I know some of you out there are actually involved in road funding, and others of you have come to this hoping to learn a little bit about it. But take a look at this flow chart here, and you'll see the green check mark and the red X. Do you think you've got an understanding of how Indiana transportation funding works? Green check mark for yes and red X for no. And you wouldn't have to have a complete understanding of this particular flow chart, but let's see if you can check our green, the green check mark for yes and the red X for no.
And you want to know that's under the participants.
It's under the participants.
Scroll over the green.
Just scroll over the green and click on participants. You can find the check marks and the X marks. Here we go. All right, so we're getting some obviously what I'm looking for are red X marks here. So if we see actually some green check marks, I'm impressed. We do have a green check mark, so I should probably consult with the person who just did that as someone who understands this, because I will tell you I do not fully understand everything that goes on with Indiana transportation funding. Now you can find this flow chart in the Legislative Services Agency's handbook, and I think it's also on the web in various places. What I want to do, though, is to take a look at some of the main features of this incredibly complicated chart. And so let's do that, and let's do it this way instead of trying to run through that chart. Now let's take a look at the revenues, and then the costs, and then the distributions of these revenues for road construction through our formula. Now, Indiana's got two formulas for doing this, two different accounts. One's called the motor vehicle highway account. One is technically called the special distribution account, although the locals will know that as the local road and street account. And so I've always seen this as the MVH LR&S system, the motor vehicle highway fund and the local road and street account. So two different formulas through which we distribute motor fuel taxes and registration fees and other stuff, other revenue, out to the State Department of Transportation, to the county highway departments, and then to the city and town road and street departments. So where's the money come from? Well, motor fuel tax, that's the gasoline tax, $318 million. Special fuel tax, $153 million. The motor carrier surtax on the trucks, $46 million. Some of the license fees from the license branches goes into highway funding. There's something called the International Registration Plan revenue, and I had to look this up because it's a fairly significant revenue source. They're almost $100 million. What this is an agreement that the United States has with Canada. And this is Indiana's share of Canadian registration fees based on the amount of miles that Canadian trucks actually travel on our roads. And so the Canadians, when they use our roads, actually help us pay for the road maintenance. So thank you to Canada, eh? You also see the last line there, state sales tax, $63.8 million, and this is new. And when you take a look at the increase that we saw in local road funding in 2014, this is one of the reasons that happened. The state said, hey, let's actually take some money, let's earmark some money, dedicate some money from the state sales tax, our 7% sales tax, to road funding and run it through the distribution in the motor vehicle highway fund. And so it's 1% of all of the sales tax revenue that we collect. Now, I don't mean 1% out of the 7% sales tax. I mean 1% of the total revenue collected. The total revenue collected is in the $6.5 to $7 billion range. And so in 2014, $63.8 million, 1% of the sales tax revenue was put into the motor vehicle highway fund. Now, you know, this is actually partly the result, I think, of some lobbying that the local folks did. They pointed out that if we like this user fee idea, that we have the excise taxes are on gasoline, and that revenue is used to pay for road construction. We also apply the 7% sales tax to gasoline as well, and the 7% sales tax raises actually quite a bit of revenue on gasoline tax. I tried to figure out how much, and my guess is if you take the $2.9 billion of gallons that are sold times the $2.50 gasoline price, that's $7.25 billion in spending on gasoline. 7% of that's about $500 million, which means that something between 5 and 10% of all the sales taxes we collect come from sales taxes on gasoline sales. And what the local road and street folks said was, hey, let's devote some of that revenue to road construction, and the state agreed, and as of fiscal year 2014, some of the money from the sales tax is now dedicated to the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund, and that was the reason, one of the reasons for the increase in total funding that occurred in that year. So the total, $791.6 million. Well, there are some expenses that come out of this. One is refunds. When people apply, businesses, I assume, apply for refunds, you got to be able to pay that. So it's $50 million in refunds. But the two I've got in red up here are State Police and the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. We used to fund a big chunk of the State Police from the gasoline and motor fuel taxes from the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund. Up through 2013, we did that. I looked it up in 2012, and in 2012, $91 million were spent on state police, and in 2014, it was $7.9 million. And this was another change that was made in order to increase the amount of funding available for road construction. We simply said, hey, we'll pay for the state police out of the general fund, not out of the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund. And this was a change that folks had been lobbying for, that the road and street folks had been lobbying for decades, really decades, and it finally happened in 2013. So instead of 91 million, as we had in 2012, only 7.9 million in 2014. So that freed up an extra $80+ million for use with road funding. Bureau of Motor Vehicles was similar. Back in 2012, the BMV got $33 million out of the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund, and in 2014, a little bit less than $5 million. So if you add it all up, if you say 91 million for the police, now down to 8, 33 million for BMV, now down to 5, and then the extra $64 million from state sales tax, that's an extra $175 million that's being run through the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund in 2014. So a fairly significant addition, considering that the net distribution, as you can see, is about 750, fairly significant addition to road funding in 2014 and going forward. Well, after all the adjustments and so forth, the net distribution is $753 million. And how do we divide that up? Well, the State Department of Transportation gets 53% of it, which turns out to be $385.2 million. The counties get 32% of it, and the cities and towns get 15%. So that's the 47% that goes to the locals. Of course, you're going to give 32% to counties and 15% to cities and towns. You've got to figure out some way of divvying that money up among the 92 counties and the 500+ cities and towns that share in all this money. So how do we do it? And this is where the road funding formula comes in, the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund. For the counties, they say, all right, we're going to take 5% of that $250 million and we're going to divvy it up into 92 segments. So Marion County and Crawford County and Tippecanoe County and Benton County all get the same amount of that 5%. So we divide it up equally for that 5%. 30% is based on vehicle registrations as a share of the state total. So if your county has 1% of the total vehicles registered in the state, you get 1% of 30% of $250 million as your share. Notice that this is all vehicles, cars and trucks and motorcycles and every vehicle that gets registered. I know there's an issue with that, and we'll get to that here in just a minute. 65%, almost 2/3, is based on road mileage. So you take the total county road mileage out there, you take your county's share, and 65% of the $250 million is divvied up based on road mileage. For cities and towns, it's much simpler. It's simply based on population. So you take the total population of cities and towns in Indiana, and the share that each city or town has of that total is the share of the $117 million that they get. So that's how the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund divvies up the money. That's where the revenue comes from. That's the amount we take off the top. That's how much DOT gets, NDOT gets, and that's how the counties and cities and towns get their revenue. But there's an entirely additional fund as well called the Special Distribution Account. Now, it's smaller, but it gets revenue, a piece of the revenue from the motor fuel taxes, a piece of the revenue from special fuel taxes, and some of the revenue from license fees. That adds up to $165 million in total. And so that gets divvied up, and it gets divvied up differently. And here's how it goes. 55% goes to the state share, so that's $91 million, and 45% goes to the local share, and that's $74 million, and there's a typo on your handout there, and so do correct that for me, please. Not $165.4 million, it is $74 million. So 55% to the state, to NDOT, and 45% to the locals. But again, how do we divvy it up among the locals? How are we going to do that? Well, here's the formula for that. This is the local road and street account, and again, 74 million, not 165. It's distributed to counties first, so this is money going to be for the county highway departments and for the city and town road and street departments, but it's distributed first among the counties, and it's based on auto registrations, just automobile registrations. And oh my goodness, is that controversial. I suspect that what happened was that when this special distribution account was invented, when this formula was created, pickup trucks were thought to be vehicles that were used by farmers off-road for the most part. And so they were not counted as putting wear and tear on the roads that we pay for with this money. Now, of course, pickup trucks are a vehicle of choice for lots and lots and lots of people as their regular old vehicles, and not necessarily as a business vehicle, and certainly not just as a farm vehicle. And yet we continue to exclude pickup trucks from the way that this money is distributed among counties. And this is an issue. Just about every year in the legislature, legislation is proposed to add pickup trucks to auto registrations in distributing the special distribution account. Now remember, total registrations are used for the MVH account, which is the big one, but for this smaller account, only auto registrations are used. And so in my many years working with the Legislative Services Agency, eventually we had to come up with some with a spreadsheet basically that would try to figure out what would be the impact if we added pickup trucks to auto registrations. And it turns out that the impact is very, very small. Of the $74 million that are distributed through the special distribution account in the LR&S here, local road and street account, about $5 million would be moved around if you added pickup trucks. Now, sure enough, if you add pickup trucks, the money moves from bigger cities and towns to smaller cities and towns, and from bigger counties to smaller counties. So this is something that would help the rural areas and the smaller towns at the expense of the bigger towns and the suburban and urban counties. This is a zero-sum game when you're talking about a formula that divvies up money. There's only $74.4 million to divvy up to the local road and street account, and how we divvy it up, if one unit gets one more dollar, some other unit has to get one less dollar. So it rearranges a rather small amount, about $5 million in total. The legislation never passes. And when you look at it, in fact, these ways of distributing revenue among the counties and the cities and towns from the MVH and the LR&S account have been amazingly stable over the years. In fact, I don't know of a single change that has been made since at least I've been in Indiana, and that's the early 1980s. When you compare that to the school funding formula, which divvies up a whole lot more money than this, we change that sometimes very substantially every 2 years. And yet this has been incredibly stable. And I think one of the reasons is that the regional interests must be so well balanced. Urban versus suburban versus rural, north versus middle versus south, we're in some sort of long-run political equilibrium here, and so hardly any proposals get passed. For example, when the pickup truck thing goes forward, and I've been in hearings where this has been true, the money would shift from pickup, if you added pickup trucks, would shift from urban to rural. So the urban folks say, hey, let's go into the MV&H account and count lane miles, not simply straight line miles. Now, straight line miles are just the miles of road, no matter how many lanes there are. But the urban folks say, hey, a 4-lane highway costs twice as much to maintain as a 2-lane highway. Shouldn't we count 4-lane highways double? And when you do that, sure enough, the money shifts from rural to urban. I've also heard arguments from the northern counties that, hey, we've got snow removal that the rest of the state doesn't have. Shouldn't snow removal be counted in the formula? And then the southern counties come up with, well, what about hills? It costs more to maintain a road on a hill than it does on the flat area, and we've got a lot of hills here. And so what do the counties in the middle say? They say freezing and thawing. That's what they say. It's freezing and thawing that really breaks up the roads. You ought to take account of that. Well, there you go. Every region has its own particular favorite adjustment to make the formula, and none of them seem to manage to get together to create a majority to make a formula change. And so we've seen terrific stability, amazing stability in the Local Road and Street Fund distribution and MVH distribution formulas. Local Road and Street actually has a little quirk here, how once you get the money out to the counties, how do you divide it up among the counties, the cities, and the towns? For smaller counties, less than 50,000, you do it based on a little bit on population and a whole lot on road mileage. And so this is, you take the total county road mileage, how much of it is out in the county, how much of it is city and town, and you divvy it up on those percentages. For population, you say how much is in cities and towns, how much is it in unincorporated areas of the county, and you divide it by 20%. For big counties, more than 50,000 population, it's more based on population than road mileage, and so I think the big city that is in the big county probably benefits from that. So that's how the distribution formulas work, and as I mentioned, amazingly stable over these many, many years. One thing I wanted to do was to try to look at some of the other sources of revenue and then look at the total budgets that our local governments devote to highways and roads and streets and bridges as well. So I went into the 2015 budgets, which are available on the Department of Local Government website, and simply took all the funds that are labeled, for those of you in the know, all the funds that are labeled in the 700s have to do with highways, roads, streets, and bridges. And here's the budget, as you see, for the counties. About $400 million budgeted for roads, streets, and bridges by the counties. And of that amount, as you can see, about $62 million is paid for with property taxes, and almost all of that is in cumulative bridge funds. And so the counties are allowed to adopt a cumulative bridge fund on their property tax rates in order to help pay for the bridges that they're responsible for, and the counties are responsible for most of the bridges in the state. You will notice that there is no property tax devoted to the general motor vehicle, highway, and local road and street funds. Until very recently, in fact, counties were prohibited from using property taxes for roads. And that was true for just decades and decades. But recently, I believe it was 2012 or 13, somewhere in there, we passed a bill that said, no, let's let counties use property taxes for roads. And again, this is in response to the lag in the revenue coming up from the gasoline and special fuels taxes. However, as far as I could see, there were no counties that were using property taxes in their budgets in 2015 for the motor vehicle, highway, and local road and street funding for those particular funds. And I suspect what happened was that while, yes, property taxes can now be used for these functions, property tax revenue itself is tight under the tax caps and so forth, and under the property tax controls. There's not that much property tax to go around either, and all of it's already committed to something else, and so counties have not decided, as far as I can tell, counties have not decided to use property taxes for road funding. Cities and towns, on the other hand, have used. They've always been able to do it, and over the years they have devoted some of their property tax revenue to their motor vehicle highway budgets. You can see $86 million out of the $255 million that cities and towns devote to highways comes from the property tax. Indianapolis, you notice, has a special line down there. If you've ever tried to use the state budget numbers, you'll know that Indianapolis doesn't really fit in the categories that we use, and that's because of Unigov, because the county and the city have combined many of their functions into one. And so I just took their public works transportation budget and added it in separately for fear of distorting the other numbers. But for the cities and towns, then you get $345 million, of which almost $88 million comes from the property tax. Here's the total for all local units, counties and cities and towns, almost $750 million altogether, of which $150 million comes from the property tax levy. So there's about $450 million coming from motor vehicle, highway, local road, and street. That adds up to about $600 million, which means we've got about $150 million unaccounted for. I suspect maybe half that might be coming from local income taxes and maybe some charges and fees, and the rest of it's probably coming from the surtax and wheel tax. So let's conclude now with the actual local option that the wheel tax and the surtax have. And I would like to ask a couple of questions here. Let's use the polling, and let's use the green checks and the red X's. Let's just take a poll out there. Green check if your county has the surtax and wheel tax. Red X if your county doesn't have the surtax and wheel tax. And let's see if we can't take a poll right there. You see the map up here on your screen. But some of you may know whether your counties do have it or not. And again, Tamara, where we go to get that from on the participants list, as you look at the green bar up top, you can do it. And I see, well, we're looking at about, well, it looks like we've got about half and half for those of you who responded, which makes sense, because that's about what it is statewide. Okay, we got 19 yeses and 12 nos. Out of the folks. Let me, though, also give you a poll. Okay, so we'll open a poll. Has your county considered the wheel tax and surtax? So those of you who, what do we want to say? If you haven't got it, have you considered it? Let's do that. For those of you who got the red X's, has your county, do you know if your county has considered the wheel tax or the surtax? We got yes, we got no, we got not sure up there. And so, let's see, and that means that the people who said that their counties had it aren't answering this. But we're getting some folks saying that, yes, they do. So, let's see, I think we're probably up there, right? So let's close the poll. And what we see is, well, we got time remaining here. Well, WebEx doesn't let us cut it off unless it thinks we've given you enough time. So okay, WebEx, we'll wait here. And I know I tend to want to get on with it. So we'll give you a few more seconds. And here we go. And what did we get? Well, we had 13 saying yes, 5 saying no, 5 saying not sure. And what that tells me is there's some active consideration out there of the surtax and wheel tax, and so we need to take a look at this. You know, Purdue gave me this mapping software a while back, and since then I've been mapping pretty much everything you can think of. Sometimes drawing a map really is revealing in a way that just looking at a table of data would not be. And this is one of the best cases of that. What you have here are all of the counties that have the surtax and wheel tax or will have it by 2016. So you can get this information from the Bureau of Motor Vehicles website, and they have a table of rates for every county. So you have to click through all the counties to see whether they've got it or not. Currently 50 counties have it, but I also found a couple of counties, Huntington, Miami, that according to newspaper reports, or media reports I should say, have adopted it and will be using the wheel tax and surtax at least in 2016, if not in 2015. So I believe what we've got now are 52 of our 92 counties that have the wheel tax and surtax. And you can see when things have been adopted. The dark blue before 2001, the light blue from 2001 to 7, the pink from 7 to 13, and the red since 2013. And you can see we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 counties that have adopted since 2007. And a whole lot more that have adopted since 2001. And of course, 2001 is the year in which gasoline taxes peaked and began to fall. So I think the wheel tax adoptions have been at least partly in response to this shortfall in funding that's been coming out of the gasoline tax. You see a couple of counties in gray there, Hamilton and Clark. Those are counties that had the surtax and wheel tax but have rescinded it. So this is a tax that once you've adopted it, you can rescind it, and you can in fact rescind it and then adopt it again. And that's what happened in Madison County, actually. Madison County rescinded the tax in 2013 and then reinstated it in 2014. So very clearly a lively debate in Madison County about whether to have this tax or not. But they're back in. They're listed on the BMV website as having the tax now. The thing that you notice when you look at this chart is that the adopting counties run from the southwest to the northeast, and that the corners of the state in the northwest and the southeast haven't got it. In fact, there are no counties in Indiana that have the wheel tax that don't have a neighbor that has the wheel tax. Or another way to say it more positively, every county that has it also has a neighbor that has the wheel tax. And this leads me to think that one of the things that leads counties to adopt the tax is whether a neighboring county has adopted the tax. And that might be because if the neighbors are debating it, well, that maybe if they think it's a good idea, maybe we ought to look at it too. Or maybe it's that, hey, if they've adopted it, we can adopt it too, because if we adopt it, we won't be chasing a bunch of businesses to a neighboring county. And so it might be a sort of economic development kind of thing as well. But for whatever reason, as you can see, we don't have any counties up in those in the northwestern corner or the southeastern corner that have the wheel tax. Clark County had it. They were off separate out there in the southeastern portion of the state, but they rescinded it. So when we look at this, we might say, oh, I'll bet you there's some debate about the surtax and wheel tax in Wabash County and Grant County, since they are now both surrounded or are about to be surrounded by counties that actually have the wheel tax. Boone as well, I would guess, sees debate, and maybe Hamilton considers it as well. But that surtax and wheel tax, the map, I think, provides a very interesting regional pattern. Well, here's some details about the wheel tax and surtax. It is a tax that's adopted by counties, by the county council. It's passed by an ordinance. In 2013, and again, it's the most recent revenue I've got. It comes, I usually get it from Legislative Services Agency's handbook. And that will, when they come out with their handbook here in December, we'll get the 2014 numbers. $73.4 million in total. The surtax delivers 89% of it. And that's simply because there are a whole lot more cars than there are trucks. The surtax is a tax on light vehicles, motorcycles, automobiles, and pickup trucks, light trucks. And the tax can either be on a percentage basis, that is a percent of the motor vehicle excise tax. So you can take up to 10% of the motor vehicle excise tax payment and tack on a surtax, and that's why it's called a surtax. But these days, most counties just adopt a per vehicle amount, which you can adopt up to $25 per vehicle. So most counties have been doing that lately, and that may be because the motor vehicle excise tax actually saw a decline back in the 1990s when that tax rate was cut. The wheel tax is a tax on heavier vehicles, so your 18-wheelers are taxed by the wheel tax, but it's not a tax per wheel. And you know, certainly when I first heard of the wheel tax, I thought, oh, the 18-wheeler pays a tax for each of the 18 wheels. Well, no, that's not it. They just pay a tax on the cab and on the trailer. And the tax is a fixed dollar amount, and it can range all the way up to $40. And the counties have a good deal of discretion over which kinds of vehicles pay which kind of tax. $40 for a big tractor trailer, for example. Both the tractor and the trailer would have to pay the 40. Boat trailers and those sorts of things, and horse trailers that are owned by just regular old citizens, not for business purposes, are usually taxed less. But if you go to BMV, you can see the whole grid of different tax rates for the different purposes. Revenues per person, about $17.85 among all those counties that have adopted. The maximum is in Tipton at $32.43. They've got their surtax at $25 per vehicle, and virtually all of their heavy vehicles taxed and trailers taxed at $40, the maximum. Vanderburg has the minimum per person at $7.49. Their surtax is just 2% of the motor vehicle excise tax, and their maximum on heavy vehicles is $23. So the rates that you decide to charge can make a very big difference on the amount of revenues that you actually receive. How much more could be raised? Well, if you take the average rate there, revenues per person at $17.85, multiply it by the population of the counties that don't have it, you get an extra $40 or $45 million that could be raised from the surtax and wheel tax. So it's, in total, it's a number that is actually close to the amount that's raised from the LR&S. So in a sense, you're basically adding an additional LR&S amount of revenue. It's not an amount that is comparable to the motor vehicle highway account amounts, but nonetheless, it is the local option for road funding that we have offered to our local governments. Well, here is the list of sources that I used, and I put this on here because those of you who are interested in road funding might want to take a look at some of these sources. Again, the U.S. Highway Statistics is just a terrific revenue or source of data from the Federal Highway Administration. The Bureau of Census there, their State and Local Government Finances series, which comes out every year. This is not the Census of Governments. This is actually some survey they take annually. Gives you some sort of broad detail about state and local governments among all of the states in the country. Indiana Highway Revenues and Distributions, take a look at the Legislative Services Agency handbooks. They're online back into the late 1990s, so you can follow what's gone on in terms of state revenue collections and also the wheel tax and the motor vehicle excise surtax. And the distribution formulas, too. You can find that, that wonderful flow chart that they've put together. And then for Indiana surtax and wheel tax rates, the Indiana Bureau of Motor Vehicles has the grids for all of those. Well, I've been talking for a good hour and 20 minutes here. As I said, there's an awful lot to cover here. Let's take a break for about 5 minutes. I will put this thing on mute, and if you do have questions, use the Q&A for that, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the remaining time. So 5-minute break. We'll be back at about 12:24. Okay, here we are back again in about 5 minutes, and we do have some good questions. We also have a comment here. Actually, I want to say this. Warwick County has raised their surtax from 7 to 10%. I think that's what the comment is referring to. And this tells me that you can, the counties, once they adopt the surtax and the wheel tax, not only can they rescind it if they want to and then reinstate it if they want to, but they can make adjustments in the rates. And adjustments in rates are made every year, in fact, by some counties or others, as well as getting the new adoption. So it's very much a live thing. You know, there's that one piece of the local option income tax where once you adopt it, it is permanent forever. But that's not true of the wheel tax or surtax by any means. You can adopt it, you can rescind it, you can change it once you have adopted it. So that's a good thing to know. Let's go down the list of questions here. And I noticed some of the questions were kind of spoiler alert kind of questions where I was rather dramatically talking about this, that, and the other thing, and then eventually revealed what I thought about it. And so we've got a thing here, decline in gas tax revenue since 2004 traces to rapid rise in oil prices. Yeah, you bet it does. And so as the price went up, certainly over the 10-year period, really, from the early mid-2000s to just recently, I think that made a big contribution to the decline in gasoline sales, which is why I think now that gas prices have come down, we really ought to see something of an increase in gasoline sales again, which really ought to deliver a little bit of extra revenue, which really ought to make the problem, the solution to the problem of road funding, a little easier. Now, we've still got that long-term problem of the fuel efficiency, which sort of builds year after year after year after year. So in the long run, that's the trend. But in the short run, we may have given ourselves a little break here if the past is prologue. If the responses of consumers and businesses to prices and income from the past hold true, we should see an increase in gallonage sales and revenues from the taxes on those gallons in the near future. Let's see, what else have we got? Would not miles of road per person in a state be a better comparison rather than dollars spent per person? You know, I looked at that, and I looked at also rather than dollars per person. I looked at dollars per road miles and dollars per auto registration. I even tried dollars per or road miles per square mile. And you know, for every problem that solved, another one was created. So I think maybe the thing to do is to try to get some comparable states and do it. Now, Tamara pointed out to me that maybe looking at population density as a way of comparing Indiana to other states might be the better way to go. I can tell you a couple of things, though. I did do a map, and we put it on Twitter a few months ago of interstate miles per square mile of state. Just to demonstrate that, yes, indeed, Indiana really does have a lot of interstates. I also think that we probably have more road miles per person than the average state, road miles per capita. The reason I think that is because when you do spending per person and compare it to spending on highways per road mile, whereas we rank in the 40s among the states in spending per person, we rank in the 30s among the states in spending per road mile, which tells me we must have more road miles. That makes sense. Tamara, more road miles, or would it be less road miles? I got to do the algebra, I'm sorry. But anyway, looking at it in different ways gives you different results. But we usually, just about every measure I've looked at, we usually wind up in the bottom half or the bottom third of the states. So I really do think that we are generally low spenders on these things, which makes sense, as I said, given the tax rates that we use. We have, I thought state police were now funded out of the state general fund, and yes, that's right. There's still a little residual. I'm not sure what that is, but there's still a little residual going to the state police, but almost all the state police is now funded out of the general fund, and you know, I think this is one of those I want to give it away before I said. But you're right. We have switched state police to the general fund, the DMV to the general fund as well, and that has freed up quite a bit of money to be added to road maintenance. Let's see, of the wheel tax and surtax money collected, does the county get 100%? No, in fact, I should have said that. Once you institute the wheel tax and the surtax, and remember the surtax is 90% of the total, once you institute that, then the money gets divvied up among the county and the cities and towns. And I think it's divvied up based on, you know, now I can't remember whether it's the MVH formula or whether it's the LRNS formula. It's one of the other formulas and divvy it up among the county and the cities and towns on that basis. Maybe it's MVH because I don't remember the pickup truck issue coming up with the wheel tax and the surtax. So it's that way. But you know, for a while, for a long time in the 80s and 90s, here was this wheel tax surtax option available, and hardly any counties were adopting it. And only really got going after road funding slacked off after 2001. And we wondered why. Well, here's a revenue source. You could improve your roads. Why not? And one of the ideas that folks came up with was, well, here it's up to the county council to actually adopt the thing, and they take the flack, the political flack for raising taxes, but then they got to distribute a whole bunch of the money to the cities and towns who get the money for politically free, essentially. So we thought that perhaps that was discouraging counties from adopting these taxes. Now, you know, much more recently, we've seen a lot of it. Well, certainly the number of counties that have have doubled, or maybe more than doubled since 2001. So we're getting a lot more adopting. But yeah, the money is actually divvied up among the counties and the cities and the towns. We had a question here. Is there any proposed legislation for next year on how MVH money is distributed or changes? We don't know yet. Proposal will only now be trickling into the Legislative Services Agency, and it really gets going in November and December. So it's kind of too soon to tell about proposed legislation. And I don't follow individual legislators closely enough to know whether anyone's talking about it. We usually get some proposals every year. As I said, the pickup truck issue comes up just about every year and is put into a bill. But we haven't know whether anything new is going to come along this time. And as I said, we haven't seen a change in the distribution anyway for a long, long time. And the change that we made of taking the police and the BMV out of the distribution formula was the first major change in the formula in a very, very long time. And I say very long time because I don't know the last time the change was made. It's been very stable. So I suspect there will be proposed legislation. If history is any judge, it will have a tough road in the legislative process. Let's see, does the surtax and wheel tax have to be passed by the county? Would that revenue then be distributed partially to cities and towns? Well, yeah, that's, of course, you don't know the same questions that we're asking from other folks. Yes, the county councils are responsible for adapting the surtax and wheel tax, and it does get distributed to cities and towns as well.
By the way, and I believe they can hear me from here,
okay.
The excise surtax and wheel tax are distributed based on the local road and street account.
It is local road and street, okay. So it's local road and street. And of course, the pickup truck issue would not come up because that's how state revenue is distributed among the counties. So local road and street is how we distribute the, let's get this thing up here, the wheel tax and surtax. So for counties less than 50,000, it's 20% based on population and 80% on road mileage. For counties more than 50,000, it's 60 on population and 40 on road mileage. So it's the LRNS formula. Thank you, Tamara, for finding that. As long as it hasn't changed, we're thumbing through an old handbook, and you know, the handbooks are online, but I do actually have hard copies that I can pull off my shelf in emergencies, and so that's what it was, at least the last time that we looked. Let's see, does any road funding funnel to other uses? Example, bike trails, walking trails. I did try to do a quick look. My thinking is yes, probably it is. It's a very small amount relative to the total, but I couldn't pick out right away anything out of the formula. Mass transit does receive some revenue. Maybe I'm thinking of the sales tax that it's earmarked from, yeah, I'm thinking that there is. But again, I just don't have that information at my fingertips. And if it is, out of the total, it's an extremely small amount. Chart on LRS distribution shows what percentages go to counties versus cities and towns within the large counties and within the small counties, but not what overall LRS money goes to the two categories of large versus small counties. Have that figures? I might be able to find that. I can take a look, but I don't have it right away. I'll take that question and try to get back to you on that one. So we'll try to do that one. When is the revenue collection distributed? Revenue 2014 available for 15, or is it longer? See, how must that be done? Boy, again, I think you've caught me here with some information I don't have at my fingertips. I believe the revenue is distributed on a monthly basis as a sort of pay-as-you-go basis. I know certainly the gasoline and motor fuel taxes are collected on a monthly basis, remitted by the gas stations and by the owners of the gas stations. It's remitted month by month, and so my impression is that it is remitted back to the counties and then funneled through the formula month by month. Again, I'll have to get back to you on that, so we'll try to take a look at those two questions and find a way to post those answers. We have a few more here. Is there a direct correlation between excise taxes and overall gas prices among the states? For example, gas in Tennessee is lower than it is in Indiana, yet Indiana's excise tax is lower. Yes, there is. There's a correlation, but it's not the only thing that matters. If you go to, say, Pennsylvania, where the excise tax is 50 cents, you will generally find gasoline taxes or gasoline prices higher. I know in New York, where I occasionally go, I got a sister who lives in New York, I generally see gasoline prices higher. But there's so many other things that matter. For example, you may recall a spike in gasoline prices for a couple of weeks. Was it last month, I think it was, or the month before, because the refinery up in Lake County had some difficulties, had to shut down or had to restrict production, and that drove up hours. When there's a hurricane in the Gulf and the pipelines are shut down, it affects all of those states served by that pipeline, but not the others. So proximity to refineries, whose pipeline you're on, how much competition there is among your local gas stations, all that stuff matters as well for gasoline prices, and then the excise taxes matter as well.
But there's another issue here too, and that's that Indiana charges a sales tax, applies a sales tax to gasoline sales.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Tennessee does or not.
Yeah, that's another thing. You got those 10 states that apply the sales tax, and so that's an additional thing. So if you take a look at that chart that the Petroleum Institute put out, one would guess that on average, over several years, that those states that have the higher taxes would generally have higher gasoline prices. But given that other things matter as well, it's a correlation. It's not determinant. A good question though. That's interesting on the correlation there. Is there any help out there to get funding for local road projects for small towns? Any help? Well, this is, when you're talking about help for local funding like that, I would say the people to ask there are the county association and the cities and towns associations. That's where you would go. Where else could you get money for this sort of thing? Property taxes now opened up, where there's always a possibility for local road projects, but of course your property taxes are already committed, and that's as true in small towns as it is in big cities. Your local income taxes can be used for general purposes. Even the economic development income tax can be used now for roads, so that's a possibility as well. Wheel tax, if you haven't got it, you can lobby your county to try to get that. So those are your general tax sources. If you're thinking about economic development funds, certainly TIP money is occasionally used to pay for roads. But economic development funds, I think probably the best place to go on that is Association of Counties, Association of Cities and Towns, if only to be directed to other places where this kind of information and this kind of funding might be available. So I'm afraid that's the best I can do for you on that one. County road bridge budget question: can counties spend property tax money on roads without having a specific levy for it? That is my current belief. Now, counties, as I said, from time immemorial, and I believe I heard once that it went at least back to the 1930s, counties were prohibited from using general property taxes for roads. But that law has been changed now, and now counties can. They don't, but they can use property taxes for roads. Cities and towns have always been able to do that, and they do use it. Now counties, as you know, the property taxes that go to roads, streets, and bridges for our counties are specific rates. Cumulative Bridge Fund is the big one used to fund bridges. But it is now possible that counties could budget money out of their general property tax levies, out of their general property tax rates, and use that for roads and streets. Now, maybe what you're saying is, hey, we got to devote a particular rate to the funds. I think you could probably do that. I'm thinking it's not necessary, but I've already stretched my information on this as far as I want to go, so I wouldn't want to go further than that. Point being, counties can now use property taxes for roads. Well, I don't see any other questions or comments here on either the Q&A or the chat, so I think, no, I guess we do. Oh, here it is. Oh, somebody who knows more than I do. Thank you for that. We do get MB&H and LRNS distributions monthly, says a clerk treasurer in one of our towns. So thank you for that. That was my impression, and that makes sense because that's how the money is paid. So I'm glad to see that I guessed right on that one. So distribution monthly on MBH and LRNS monies. Okay, so I see that we're done. Tamara, we're going to do another one of these probably in February. And at that time, I don't know, we were thinking of doing something big with local budgets. Remember that idea we had?
No, that's something different.
Oh, that's something different. Forget that.
Probably a legislative update in February, and we may also see what's going on with farmland assessment.
Yes. Yeah, there are big things going on with farmland assessment. There are going to be hearings starting next week, as a matter of fact. And so we'll probably talk about farmland assessment. Of course, the legislative session will have opened up, and we'll have a new revenue forecast in December. So we'll probably talk about that as well, coming in the on local government in February. But wait a minute, last minute. I believe you said the municipalities can implement its own tax for MVH purposes, or does it have to be imposed by the county? When I say own tax, I mean, well, let's see, the wheel tax and surtax can only be implemented by the county, but cities and towns can use property taxes for roads. Cities and towns can do that. And if they wanted to designate part of the property tax for that purpose, I think they can. When I look at the budgets, I see that the MV&H funds do have particular city property tax rates associated with them. So cities and towns can do that. They can devote a particular part of the property tax rate to the MVH fund that also receives the money from the state. So that's, yeah, I want to clear that up. There is no local option, wheel, or surtax that cities and towns can enact. If the cities and towns want it, they'll have to go to the county council and lobby, offer them something in exchange, I suppose, politically. But there's no wheel tax for cities and towns. Okay, so
February, but between now and then, follow us on Twitter.
That's right. As I should mention, we are on Twitter. Tamara and I run a Twitter account. It's @InTaxRockstars. So if you do the @ and @InTaxRockstars, that's us. We thought maybe we'd call it In Tax Gurus, but we kind of like the rock stars better. And so that's where we are. And Tamara's been tweeting away as we've been doing this. And so you can find some screenshots of what we took here today. And we do try to post 2-3 times a week, usually get something posted. And we're always grateful for new followers. And again, February, next on local government, watch for that. We do announce that on Twitter, and certainly your local extension educators will have information about that as well.
We'll also be sending out a recording here by the end of the week and a survey. So please take the survey. That's one of the reasons why we had road funding today.
There you go. We took a survey in the past, and people said, hey, let's do road funding. So we did. And hope this proved useful to you, and we'll sign off now. Thanks very much for listening. I'm Larry DeBoer. I'm here with Tamara Ogle for On Local Government.